Welcome to Not What I Thought. I'm Erica.
I'm Yolanda.
And I'm Becca. We're therapists, entrepreneurs, and perfectly imperfect humans.
We first met during a business owner retreat where we became fast friends because we're not afraid to be real and ask the hard questions about life. What we thought it would be like, how messy it actually is, and the courage it takes to create the life we want.
We continue to build our friendship and personal growth through our own retreats. We find the deepest connection in sharing our struggles and finding what we have in common rather than what divides us.
We're breaking down hard topics on our podcast and together have conversations about what it takes to find real talk, real support, and real rest for professional women. We're glad you're here. Join us on your favorite podcast platform.
Welcome back to the Not What I Thought podcast. Today we have the amazing Judi with us to share her Not What I Thought story. So Judi, what's your story?
So we live in a pronatalist society, I think it's pretty fair to say.
Yep.
It's expected that we're probably going to settle down and have kids, and it's quite a family-centric world, really. And I think many of us don't actually question it. We just, we evolve through life. And I say that in as much as a lot of us don't really have a life plan. We don't really imagine that future that we're going to live. We just, go through school, we leave school, we do whatever it is, whether it's go to university or go and get a job. And then, the next organic step is we maybe find a relationship and maybe we get married and we have children. But was that what we wanted? Did we really check in with ourselves and say, is this the path I want? So for me, I had a slightly dysfunctional childhood, it's quite fair to say. And I had parents who didn't let us make decisions and have opinions. And I didn't realize how profoundly that affects our future, because suddenly you're out there in the big wide world and you're offered the opportunity to make a decision and you have no idea how to make that decision. You don't know who you are. If somebody's made all of your decisions for you and any personality that you had has been squashed, you don't know what you want either. And so that was essentially what happened with me, but it was compounded by developing a chronic illness in my teens. So of course, not only was I out there, but I was out there with severe limitations. And of course, having had a dysfunctional childhood, the next step up was I was always going to have dysfunctional adult relationships. So in my first real long-term relationship, we never mentioned getting married or having children, which looking back on a 6-year relationship, God, that's really bizarre, So I eventually escaped from that with no support from my parents because that wasn't who they were. And I then met somebody else and we got married, but we got married on the proviso that he would have children. And then 2 weeks after the honeymoon ended, he said, I'm not having any more children. He didn't word it quite as kindly as that, but that was the essence of what he was saying. And so, of course, that marriage sort of spiraled down. And so, I found myself in my early 30s with a relationship that ended. With a chronic illness where I was in severe pain, couldn't use my hand, couldn't use my foot, all of these sort of limitations, and on very strong medication where I was told that I couldn't have children anyway. So I'd gone through my mother telling me that childbirth was the worst thing in the world, and if she'd have had a pregnancy after me, she would have committed suicide. So, of course, I had this slant in my mind that having children was the worst thing in the world. And there was a lot more to it as well, to going through relationships where we never spoke about children, to having a relationship or a marriage where the opportunity of children was whipped away very, very quickly, to then being in a situation where I was told I couldn't have them. because my health and my medication didn't allow it. So I guess I always thought that children would organically arrive. And then there were all these obstacles in my way that for one reason or another conspired to stop me having them. So that's my background for you.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so in the marriage, it sounds like you went into the marriage thinking we will have children. And then like you said, quickly after he said, actually, no, not going to do that. Um, was that something that you really wanted? Like, I really want to have children and I want to have children with this person? Or was that more in the category of, I feel like we're supposed to because that's what you do?
I wanted to have the opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to be able to make a decision
Mm.
that, we will have a child or whatever. He had one from a previous relationship,
Yeah.
and we had had much discussion around it. And when we talked about getting married, I said, he's only for me going to be on the basis that there is the opportunity to have a child. And he had said no initially, and then allegedly come round to that thought process, but perhaps it had been preying on his mind. And essentially he was prone to mental health issues. He was the world's greatest actor, so he spiraled into drug and alcohol addiction, and I didn't know that he had been there before, because he hid that, his family hid that. And so there was a lot behind the scenes that was concealed from me. And then when the not wanting to have any more children again came out, it sort of opened the floodgates for everything else to gradually come out. It was like the plug that was holding the water in.
Judi, I'm curious. I so resonated when you were like, I don't know how many of us give a lot of thought to the life plan. We just kind of take the next step, like school,
Mm.
then X, Y, and Z. And um, in your story, what I make up is that if you did ever think of at one point becoming a mom, it seems like it might have been a pretty complex thing, even from childhood. But I'm wondering for you, I mean, do you recall growing up and thinking one day I will have a child, or kind of what you said, I want to have the opportunity to make the decision whether or not I want to
Yeah.
have a child.
So I didn't really think about children in my childhood that much, because my mum made so many adverse comments about
Yeah,
this. My
yeah.
sister, from the age of 9 or 10, I remember her saying that she was going to have a child of every colour, and,
Mm,
all of these sorts of things. She was desperate to be a mum. But
mm,
as is typical with a lot of families and the way children are raised, we both got a different side of my mother. And
mhm,
so my sister didn't get any of those adverse comments about
mhm,
children. And she has since said to me, we had the conversation very recently about this. Mum had always said she only was having one child, and then I came along, and so I was the mistake.
mm,
And when you're called a mistake
mm,
very regularly, it does sort of
mm,
impact you.
mhm,
And my sister said to me, "Oh no, Mum planned you, and she hid that from Dad." So of course my sister had a completely different conversation with my mum,
mm,
but I had this negativity around children and
mhm,
birth, and the whole planning about having children. So I think it was always in the back of my mind, but I
mhm,
don't think I'd ever said, "Yes, I want children." That
mhm.
hadn't happened. I
Yeah,
just knew it was an option, I guess, an option that I wanted to be able to pick up on as and when.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
another thing that I make up, and I don't know if this is true for you, Judy, but it seems that as you tell your story, there are these things that happen and um, kind of dings along the way of, oh, maybe I'm not going to have a child, or um, and what I would make up is like grief points, whether I would recognize it or not. Um, was there a clear delineation for you of like this decision has been made on for me, and it appears that I won't be having children?
Not until very much later. I mean, you hit
Hmm.
upon something there about the grief. So after my
Hmm.
marriage ended, I then met somebody who I would have said was the love of my life. And
Hmm.
we were at the time, and beyond my marriage, as it were.
Hmm.
And maybe that's because I was vulnerable. But we
Hmm.
were very quickly very involved in talking about marriage and children. And that was when the thought about having children was gaining real traction,
Hmm.
and I was early 30s.
Hmm.
And suddenly the relationship one day gone. He decided he couldn't marry a divorcee.
Oh.
And at that point, I hit the deepest grief I've ever known in my life. And I,
Hmm.
I didn't I didn't necessarily understand what was happening, but I think it was the accumulation of all of these events. And as we know, being in extreme pain has a
Hmm.
profound effect on our emotional state anyway.
Hmm.
And so I had no emotional bandwidth left, and I had
Hmm.
a physical breakdown at that point.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that took me some time to recover from, because nobody asks when you have physical symptoms, and we are talking sort of 22, 23 years ago, nobody asks you what's going on in here.
Hmm.
And so, a physio, an osteopath, a chiropractor, none of those people could explain
Hmm.
why I was in such physical pain, why I was unable to move.
Hmm.
And I guess as I started to process those emotions, my body
Hmm.
started to free up a bit. And so I spent sort of 3 years on my own, just dating a bit, and then I met my, as I call him, my current husband, and by which time I'd probably processed a lot of the grief, but I was also carrying quite a lot of it, the childhood grief that you don't even realize is a thing until you understand more about the psyche, I guess. So,
Hmm.
and so when I met my husband, we didn't talk really very much about having children, because I was on this medication where I'd been told that I couldn't get pregnant. Um, and so it was a vague conversation. And it wasn't until I was approaching my mid 40s, and by which time we'd had adventures, we'd moved to the other side of the world, all of these things that fill in so that you don't think about the next step, that I
Hmm.
suddenly thought, I feel safe enough to have children. And
Hmm.
so I sort of I realized later on that I hadn't felt safe enough for so many years to
Hmm.
even embark on that conversation with myself.
Hmm. I think that leads me to my next question, which is, um, I really resonated with your description of so much control in your childhood. And again, as I hear your story, I see this arc of Judy having no control over things, a lot of significant things in your life. And I think I'm curious if you experience that differently now.
Yes, and some of that is the journey that I've been on.
Mm.
And some of that is actually losing my mum, which
Mhm.
released me. I
Mhm.
think it's fair to say it released me.
Mhm.
Whilst I started to learn quite late on that I didn't have to respond to her in the way that she pushed my buttons, and I could respond in a completely different way, which was a lot more empowering and stopped me feeling like the small child that had always been shouted at and controlled. And so things began to shift. But actually, mum dying was like flicking a switch and letting me free. And I know that sounds awful for people who've perhaps had a fabulous relationship with their parents, but for people who haven't, I think it's quite common.
Yeah. No, the three of us are shaking our head. No, it doesn't sound horrible. Yeah, it sounds very understandable. Thank you.
I just wanted to note as you were telling your story that mm, I noticed this theme like a couple different points in the story where um, maybe I didn't know if I wanted children or not until I was with the right partner or until I felt safe enough that there is some part about like it's not just me and what I want, but it's also like the circumstance and my healing and who I would be doing this with. And there's, I think where I'm going with this is I know a lot of people who are childless not by choice, maybe would have wanted children and couldn't have them, or, medical reasons or whatever, like not finding the right partner. I think that sometimes we can have a lot of like shame or regret about that. Um, and there's this maybe other opportunity for some acceptance and compassion and love around like there are some times where the circumstance just isn't right. I wasn't with the right partner
Mm,
or
mm,
all of these things that maybe weren't even in my control. If this is something that I wanted and I couldn't have, it doesn't mean that like, oh, if I had just had my shit together in a different way or whatever. It's like we
mm,
we only are where we are at the moment, and there's so much of whether that is a right choice or not that is not fully in our own control.
mm.
Um, yeah, so I didn't know
Yeah.
if you wanted to speak to that at all or talk a little bit about maybe how you've come to peace with this being where you are in your life now.
Yeah. And you hit upon something there, that being childless by circumstance is
Mm,
actually really common in the 22% of people that are childless, ladies, that is, not
yeah.
men, it's 25. But
Mm,
so often we don't meet the right person at the right time. We have dysfunctional relationships, or, there's a lot of people out there who blame themselves for not finding the right person, but they
mm,
haven't got to the stage in their journey mentally where they can relate to the fact that perhaps a dysfunctional childhood led to them not finding a relationship that was a good fit for them. And
mm,
so there's a lot of people who feel very guilty about not having been in a relationship. And I don't think that a lot of them necessarily understand what has led to them being in that position. They just see that they're not in a relationship, but not the whys. And that's likely to stem from their formative years and, perhaps conversations like my mother had with us.
mm,
Um, so yes, I'm certainly childless by circumstance. That's the long and the short of it, really. And it's many, many circumstances. It's just layers and
mhm,
layers and layers, and eventually I was too old. I was just too old, really, to embark on having children. And that's why we ended up where we did. And it took me a very long time to understand that I was grieving being childless,
mhm,
because as with any gradual shift like that, it is so slow
mhm,
that by the time we realize where we are, we're at the bottom generally.
mhm,
And we are so miserable and we cannot raise a smile at anything. We just do not tap into the joy around us. Everything's a negative. The world, I think, is in monochrome at that point. We just cannot see the colour. We cannot smell the blossom. You know, we're just tunnel vision, living inside our self-critical minds, and sort of playing over conversations and the negativity that comes from that. And I sort of one day thought, how am I going to have another 25, 30 years of living like this with no purpose, no real feel of a future, no dreams, no aspirations, no goals, just getting from one day to the next? And of course, that is grief, isn't it? What do we do when we're grieving? We just got to, get to the next second, then the next minute, then the next hour, then the next day. And that's where I found myself. So I was in deep grief. And so, of course, then I got really annoyed with myself that I was in such deep grief, that I'd wasted all of these years sitting in that headspace. So then I spent some time being really angry about it. And of course, anger is part of grief as well, isn't it? But if you don't understand all of these things, you've got it all going on, but you don't know why. And so one day I was listening to a podcast, walking along the waterfront where I live, and this lady was retraining from had retrained from being a police officer to a counsellor. And literally the day that she'd qualified, she walked away from the police, become a counsellor. I thought, oh, I'd really like to help people. I'd really like to work with people. And so I just started researching what I could do. And I came across a coaching course, and I did that course. It was quite a long course, 6 months, and I angled it towards being childless not by choice. And partway through that course, there was just a one-word mention of grief coaching, and I thought, well, what's that? So I spent a good deal of time researching that, trying to find a non-denominational course and finding something that connected with me. And New Zealand's a bit behind when it comes to dealing with your headspace. People don't talk about emotions. And so I eventually found Dora Carpenter's course out of Washington, DC, the Grief to Gratitude course. And so I signed up for that. And the course had already started. It was one of those perfect storms, And so I did that whilst I was working. I was sort of playing hooky from work and connecting on a Wednesday morning for my couple of hours with Dora and the class. And I did that course. And those two coaching courses were incredibly valuable to me in processing what had happened and what was going on and moving forwards. And so I came out the other side of that and thought, yeah, we're going to have to do something with this now. We need to go and help other people. And so I work with ladies that are childless not by choice, or childless for whatever reason. I also work with other people that are grieving, because, hey, you can't leave anybody behind. And most of the people I work with have got layers of grief anyway. But I also work as a grief educator now, because I'd worked in risk management before, and I started to connect that when I was grieving, when my mum died, because we still grieve, right? Even if we didn't have a great relationship with them, it's quite complex, isn't it? And I realized I shouldn't have been standing on the roof of tower blocks when I was grieving, because our cognitive processing is impaired. Your judgment, your decision making, your spatial awareness. And I was still doing this job, going onto building sites and going into plant rooms, and it started me down a rabbit hole of trying to understand the effects of grief in the workplace and the statistics I came across as to how grief affects us. And then I realized, well, 25% of men in the workplace are childless, and a lot of them grieve, and a number of them will be in dangerous environments. So that led me down to the education of grief in the workplace route as well, because I thought I just couldn't keep that information to myself.
I really appreciate you acknowledging that there is a grief element for men as well who are childless by circumstance. And I think that's something that, I mean, this is a podcast for women, but often we don't talk about, right? I have a client couple I'm seeing in my practice right now where they weren't able to have as many children as they want to. And it's a grief and a loss for both of them, right? But I think that's as much as we, don't want to talk about it, it's there for men too.
Absolutely. And the fact that men will often hide that grief, the grief of infertility, there are a few men that talk about this, and I think that their contribution to the subject is incredibly valuable and brave. And I think that there are a lot of men out there who will secretly and quietly admire them for it. But men are the ones who will go unacknowledged in the grief space, especially around infertility. And we talk about infertility, whereas I tend to talk about the fertility journey, because when we talk about infertility, it casts a blame. One of you is generally the one that's infertile, whereas you both embark on a fertility journey. And so I think that that's a much kinder way of addressing it, really.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's actually one of my specialties. I work with infertility or fertility with couples. And so I think you're spot on in that, like, that's a relational component, right? Going through that together. And that often looks different for both partners. So I'm actually kind of curious what that was like with your current husband, as you said, eventually, you got to a place where you're like, okay, this is not going to happen. What was that like on his side of things, if you don't mind answering?
Yeah, so he wasn't as keen to have children. In the early days when we were together, he would have embraced that. By the time I was sort of mid-40s and talking about it, his outlook on that was, well, I think we're a bit too old to bring children into the world now. And so that sort of became partly his decision that we didn't do anything about it. And I think if I was honest about it, at that point, it was this would be nice to have, nice to do. But I was terrified of it because of the negativity surrounding the whole situation from my mum. So yeah, I think it would have taken a lot of exploration and therapy to actually do anything with it. And of course, my work on myself didn't come till later on.
I remember when you were talking, Judi, about kind of realizing that you were in grief and looking at this like, oh, what do I do for the next 25 or 30 years with no purpose and no goals and whatever. I wonder, as you've worked through and come to accept that you won't have children, like what have you found now that gives your life purpose and hope?
Okay, so I try and when people talk about accept, I think for people who are going to be childless for life, because it is a life story and it is a life of hurt and triggers, we try to avoid the word accept, because accept is like you accept a marriage proposal, you accept an offer on your house, they're things that you're happy with. And so we tend to talk about we're resigned to it because we know that it's a fact, but it doesn't mean we want it. And the word acceptance, I think, puts so much pressure on people. Well, I haven't accepted it. Why haven't I accepted it? I should be able to accept it. It's that blame thing. And so it puts them backwards in their grief because they can't accept it. And I think one day in the future, You might accept it. I hear of people in their 70s who still have not accepted that this is their story. They know it's their story, but they're not accepting of it.
Thank you.
So yeah, and that wasn't said to be critical of
No,
you
no, I
at all.
really appreciate. I hadn't thought about it that way.
Yeah,
Seriously, thank you.
yeah. And for me, I think the thing that gives me fulfillment is working with people and seeing them have that shift, that bingo moment of there is a future out there. I can have a future. And as with any grief, peaks and troughs is always going to be the case. And it's very difficult in the workplace where we have policy around pregnancy, around parental leave. We have very little policy around grief other than for the 3 or 4 days compassionate leave. If somebody gives birth to a child at 22 weeks, as in they're forced to because there's a birth defect, they don't get more than the 3 or 4 days compassionate leave. And yet somebody else who gives birth to a baby at 26 weeks and it lives, they get the maternity, the paternity leave. And so I think, the policy around grief in the workplace really needs to be updated and modernized. 100% of people in the workplace are going to grieve. 75% of men in the workplace are going to be a parent, 78% of women. So why have we got a policy around something that doesn't happen to everybody when we haven't got a policy around what happens to 100% of people? So we have all of these people in the workplace having to embrace a baby shower, having to embrace bring your child to work day, having to, when you start a meeting, introduce yourself around the room. This was always my worst nightmare, especially if you're the last person around the table and the first person says, my name's so-and-so, I've been with the company 10 years, I've been in this role for 3 years, and I've got 2 children, and the next person says, all for my sins, I've got 5 children, and then somebody else says, oh, and I've got 3 grandchildren. As you watch this come around the table towards you, thinking, what do I say? Because it's child-centric. And it gets to you and you say, well, I've been here 3 years and, I've previously worked in this role in other companies. And then you stop and there's a pregnant pause. And everyone's waiting for you to say how many children you have. And in the end, the host says, yeah, okay, next one. And you're left sitting there feeling so excluded, so isolated. And then, of course, we come to the first break in this conference or whatever, and everyone's saying, oh, look at these pictures of my grandchild, and because they've all know how many children they've all got. And so I think one of the most difficult things is the pronatalist society we live in identifies people by how many children they've got. We meet somebody when we're at a party and they say, do you have children? Not what do you like to do? What are you watching at the moment? Where was the last place you travelled? Is there somewhere locally you love to eat out? Any of those questions. We identify people by how many children that they've got. And I think the conversation really needs to shift a little bit about before you had children, before you were a mum, you were a person. You were a fully rounded person, and you still are. So who are you? Because being a mum is just a part of that.
I'm really intrigued by this idea about like grief policies in the workplace. Like, what do you think if you got to choose, right? Like these would be the best, healthiest policies for workplaces around grief. Like what should we be striving for or advocating for?
Can I piggyback on that? Because as I'm listening to, I your expertise and your passion around this topic is just landing on me in such a profound and beautiful way. So, in addition to what Becca is asking, if there were a message about grief that you could shout from the rooftops that we could all hear, what might that message be?
I think very simply is let's bust out of that taboo around grief, because
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking, our first experience of grief is around the age of 3. And it might be losing our favorite cuddly bunny. It could be our
Mm-hmm.
parents divorcing and losing a grandparent. It could be all sorts of things. But what we learned from our parents was that something happened, and then probably we were put to bed as usual, and then they grieved in private. So it wasn't an open topic. So we
Mm-hmm.
go through life accumulating these grief events, some of which may or may not be processed. And one day, like me in my early 30s, we think, what on earth is happening? So we
Mm-hmm.
need to break down those taboos. In the workplace, grief needs to be talked about. It's very isolating in the workplace when you have a parent or a partner or a child die and none of your colleagues knows what to say.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so common. And so we think people don't care because they don't say anything. And actually, it's embarrassment. They don't know what to say. They don't know
Mm-hmm.
how to say it. So they don't say something. And they
Mm-hmm.
leave it for so long that it becomes so embarrassing that they can never say anything. And that breaks relationships down in the workplace. So I think breaking down the taboos is one of the most important things, and that's what I talk about is we need to have open, compassionate conversations around grief. If somebody is grieving in the workplace, we need to simply acknowledge it. They'll really appreciate us saying, I'm so sorry you lost your husband, John. We name them the value that they had in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Saying we're so sorry for your loss doesn't really
Mm-hmm.
connect with people. So acknowledging it, but I talk about how we have buddy systems in the workplace so that we're supportive of each other, so that if something is affecting somebody, the buddy will hopefully spot it, because we grieve around financial issues, about redundancy, about diagnosis of chronic health conditions, all manner of things, drug and alcohol addiction, whatever's going on in the
Mm-hmm.
background. And most of those things carry shame. So we don't talk about them in the workplace. We don't want to say, my husband's gone down the route of drug addiction. So we bury that, but we withdraw.
Mm-hmm.
So opening the conversations, having a compassionate and supportive leadership will allow people to say, do you know what? I'm just not okay.
Mm-hmm.
I need some help here, or I just need to take a little step back or whatever. And I think often in the workplace, what you'll find is when somebody takes a step back, there's that judgmental approach of, well, what's wrong with them?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they so quiet? Why are they not contributing in meetings? Why are they not coming out on social activities? And so we judge them instead of say, is there something that we can help you with?
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you. Judi, what does your heart know to be true?
Do you know what? That's a really difficult question. I think that there's a lot of anger in the world at the moment, and there's a lot of grief that's built up over the pandemic that people don't even realize they're carrying. And
Mm-hmm.
it's leading to us just being less patient with each other, less supportive, less understanding. And I think if we could all understand what we're carrying, the world could be a more compassionate place.
Mm-hmm. Erica, what does your heart know?
My heart is grateful for Judi's reminders today about bringing humanity into all spheres, but specifically the workplace. I'm grateful to own my own business so that I can implement that with my own employees.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I'm thinking to the struggles that, for example, my husband might face with being a boss, but not able to influence policy for the company in the same way that maybe he would want to, into having some of these conversations that you're talking about with his employees. So something for me to keep chewing on, but I'm personally feeling gratitude that I have some autonomy in how to implement that for the people in my personal life. So thank you, Judi.
Mm. What is your
Yolanda,
heart?
what is your heart note? True.
My heart knows that in a world where so much is out of our control, um, the choice that we have to face things like grief, to be able to work through them, and come out the other side changed, and probably do that time and time again, um, is brave action, courageous. And there's nothing quite like grief that is so uniquely such a human experience. So thank you for the conversation, Judi.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Becca, how about you? What does your heart know?
Mm. My heart knows that, much like Judi shared, often finding our way through the things that feel the most difficult for us, it includes finding connection, building community, and helping others. Thank you.
Judi, if people want to connect with you, where's a good place for them to find you?
Okay, so my business is Embrace Your Future,
Mm,
and you can find me at embraceyourfuture.net. Simply that.
great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me this morning.
Yeah.